In 1937, a sickly man sat alone in Providence, Rhode Island, dying of cancer. He had never held a steady job, never made more than a few $100s from his writing. His name was Howard Phillips Lovecraft. You've probably never read his books, but his ideas, they live inside every horror movie you've ever watched, every video game that made you afraid to turn off the lights, every cosmic terror that kept you awake at 3 in the morning. This man, who died in poverty and obscurity, created an entirely new genre of fear. Cosmic horror was born. Before Lovecraft, monsters could be killed. Vampires feared crosses. Werewolves died to silver bullets. But Lovecraft asked a different question. What if the monster was so vast, so incomprehensible, that your mind would shatter just from seeing it? What if humanity wasn't the hero of the story, but an insignificant accident in a universe that didn't even notice we existed? Today, we uncover the tortured genius behind modern horror. Childhood of terror. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, into a family that was slowly falling apart. His father, Winfield, was a traveling salesman who suffered a complete mental breakdown when Howard was only 3 years old. Winfield was committed to Butler Hospital, where he would remain until his death 5 years later. The official cause: general paresis, a form of neurosyphilis that slowly destroys the brain. Young Howard never knew his father as anything but a madman in an asylum. His mother, Sarah, became increasingly unstable after her husband's collapse. She smothered Howard with attention while simultaneously telling him he was hideous, that his face was too long, his features too strange. Quote effect. I was an ugly quote effect. These were Lovecraft's own words about himself, beliefs planted by his own mother. The family moved into the sprawling Victorian home of his maternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips. Here, in this decaying mansion filled with old books and stranger ideas, Lovecraft's imagination began to twist into something dark. His grandfather told him tales of Gothic horror and ancient civilizations. But what does this early trauma teach us about creativity born from pain? Dreams of madness. From the age of 6, Lovecraft was plagued by nightmares so vivid, so terrifying, that they would shape everything he ever wrote. He called them the night gaunts. Faceless, rubbery creatures with bat-like wings and barbed tails who would swoop down from the darkness and carry him away to impossible places. These weren't ordinary bad dreams. They were recurring visitations. Night after night, the same creatures, the same helpless terror, the same sensation of being utterly insignificant in the face of something ancient and unknowable. Modern psychologists would recognize this as night terrors, possibly triggered by the trauma of his father's institutionalization. But Lovecraft didn't have access to modern psychology. He had only his brilliant, tortured mind trying to make sense of experiences that felt more real than waking life. I would wake up screaming, unable to remember where reality ended and nightmare began. If this is resonating with you, if you've ever felt that thin line between dreams and reality, hit like and subscribe for more forgotten history that shapes our world, because what comes next will shock you even more. Instead of running from these visions, Lovecraft began to write them down, and in doing so, he discovered something remarkable: the outsider. By the time Lovecraft was a teenager, he had become almost completely isolated from the world. His health was fragile. Doctors diagnosed him with various nervous conditions. His mother, now fully descended into her own psychological problems, kept him home from school for years at a time. Alone, he educated himself in his grandfather's massive library, devouring books on astronomy, chemistry, history, and classical literature. He became obsessed with the cosmic scale of the universe, with the vast distances between stars, with the incomprehensible age of galaxies. And this obsession terrified him. The astronomy books taught him something that most people preferred not to think about. Earth was nothing. Humanity was nothing. A brief flicker of consciousness on a tiny rock, orbiting an unremarkable star in one of billions of galaxies. This cosmic perspective, combined with his night terrors and isolation, created something unprecedented in horror literature. Lovecraft wasn't afraid of monsters. He was afraid of the truth that we are utterly alone in an uncaring universe, that our existence has no purpose, no meaning, no cosmic significance whatsoever. This wasn't just fiction he was creating. Cthulhu Rises. In 1926, Lovecraft wrote a story that would change horror forever. It was called The Call of Cthulhu, and it introduced the world to a new kind of monster. Not a vampire, not a ghost, something far worse. Ancient sleeping god. Cthulhu was a being so vast, so alien, so utterly incomprehensible to the human mind that merely glimpsing it drove people insane. It wasn't evil in any human sense. It simply didn't care. It existed on a scale where humanity was less than bacteria, less than dust. The genius of Lovecraft's creation was this: you couldn't fight Cthulhu. You couldn't bargain with it. You couldn't understand it. The best humanity could hope for was that it kept sleeping. Quote effect, in his house at Ar-Laye dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Quote effect, this single line became one of the most famous in horror literature. A sleeping god beneath the Pacific Ocean, waiting, always waiting. The story was rejected by multiple magazines before finally being published in Weird Tales. It was not considered particularly successful at the time. Nobody knew that this obscure pulp story would eventually spawn an entire mythology that millions would embrace. Cosmic indifference. What made Lovecraft truly revolutionary wasn't tentacles or ancient gods. It was his philosophy. Before Lovecraft, horror was about good versus evil. Heroes could win. Light could triumph over darkness. Lovecraft looked at the universe and saw something different. The universe does not care whether you live or die. He called it cosmic indifference. The idea that whatever powers exist in the cosmos, they are so alien, so beyond human comprehension, that concepts like good and evil simply don't apply. We aren't the protagonists of reality. We're not even supporting characters. We're an accident. A temporary arrangement of atoms that will soon return to the void. This was horror stripped of comfort. No god to pray to, no devil to blame, just endless, indifferent chaos. Critics have noted that Lovecraft was essentially translating his existential terror into fiction. The death of his father, the madness of his mother, his isolation and illness, the astronomical facts that haunted him. All of it merged into a philosophy of cosmic horror that resonated with readers who felt the same unspoken dread. And yet this philosophy would find its way into places Lovecraft never imagined. The mythos grows. Lovecraft didn't just create Cthulhu. He created an entire mythology, a shared universe of cosmic horrors that other writers could play in. He called it the Cthulhu mythos. There was Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, a messenger of the outer gods who delighted in driving humans mad. There was Azathoth, the blind, idiot god at the center of the universe, surrounded by flute players keeping it eternally sleeping. Gods beyond comprehension. There was Yog-Sothoth, an entity that existed in all times and all places simultaneously. There was the Necronomicon, a fictional book of forbidden knowledge so convincingly described that people still search for it in libraries today. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. Lovecraft encouraged his friends, fellow writers like Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, to reference his creations in their own stories. This collaborative world-building was unprecedented in horror fiction. The mythos grew organically, each writer adding new horrors, new forbidden texts, new cosmic entities. What started as one man's nightmares became a shared mythology that continues to expand nearly a century later. But Lovecraft himself would never see his influence grow. Poverty and pain. Despite creating an entirely new genre of horror, Lovecraft never escaped poverty. He earned pennies per word from pulp magazines. At his most successful, he might make a few $100s a year from his writing. He survived by eating canned beans, living in increasingly shabby apartments, and ghostwriting for other authors who paid him almost nothing. His one attempt at marriage ended in disaster. He moved to New York with his wife Sonia Green in 1924, but the city's crowds and chaos triggered severe psychological episodes. Within 2 years, he had returned alone to Providence, his marriage effectively over. Quote effect. I am Providence, quote effect, he wrote, declaring his absolute identification with his hometown. He would never leave again. The Great Depression made everything worse. Markets for weird fiction dried up. Magazines folded. Lovecraft's already meager income nearly disappeared entirely. He began suffering from severe stomach pain, which he ignored because he couldn't afford doctors. By 1937, he was diagnosed with intestinal cancer. It was too late for treatment. The god of horror was dying, unknown and impoverished. Death of a god. Howard Phillips Lovecraft died on March 15, 1937. He was 46 years old. Forgotten. His death certificate listed the cause as carcinoma of the small intestine, complicated by Bright's disease. He had been in pain for months, possibly years, too proud or too poor to seek treatment until it was far too late. He was buried in the Phillips family plot in Swan Point Cemetery in Providence. For years, his grave had no marker of its own, just the family monument. It wasn't until 1977, 40 years after his death, that fans raised money for a headstone. His legacy begins. The inscription they chose came from one of his letters, I am Providence. At the time of his death, most of his work was out of print. He had no book deals, no movie options, no recognition from the literary establishment. He died believing himself a failure, a reclusive eccentric who had wasted his life writing stories that nobody wanted to read. If only he could have seen what came next. Immortal influence. After Lovecraft's death, something extraordinary happened. His friend August Derleth founded a publishing company called Arkham House specifically to keep Lovecraft's work in print. Slowly, new generations discovered his stories, and they couldn't get enough. His nightmares became the foundation of modern horror. Stephen King calls Lovecraft the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale. Guillermo del Toro based entire films on Lovecraftian concepts. John Carpenter's The Thing, Ridley Scott's Alien, the entire cosmic horror subgenre of video games, countless metal albums, board games, role-playing games. All of them trace their lineage back to a sick, lonely man writing stories in a cramped Providence apartment. The Cthulhu mythos has been expanded by hundreds of authors. Lovecraft's creatures appear in everything from South Park to True Detective. His invented word Cthulhu has entered the cultural lexicon. A dead man's fever dreams became the dominant vocabulary of cosmic fear. But his legacy contains a darker chapter that we must address. Shadows and light. We cannot discuss Lovecraft without acknowledging his profound racism. His letters and some of his stories contain views that were extreme even by the standards of his time. He feared immigrants, held white supremacist beliefs, and wrote poems so offensive they are difficult to read today. This ugliness was real, it was inexcusable, and it's part of his story. Modern scholars have wrestled with how to handle his legacy. Some argue we should separate the art from the artist. Others say his xenophobia is inseparable from his cosmic horror, that his fear of the other was projected onto fictional alien gods. Quote effect, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Quote effect, his own words reveal the connection. The same terror that drove his racism also drove his creativity. Both emerged from a profound fear of anything different, anything beyond his understanding. Today, the World Fantasy Award, once shaped like Lovecraft's face, has been redesigned. The conversation continues about how to honor artistic achievement while condemning personal bigotry. His legacy remains complicated, forever brilliant, forever tainted. Howard Phillips Lovecraft died unknown, unpublished, and unloved. Today, his influence touches nearly every corner of horror media, from poverty to immortality. He taught us that the scariest thing isn't the monster under the bed. It's the realization that the universe is vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond measure, and utterly indifferent to human existence. He took his nightmares, his isolation, his cosmic terror, and transmuted them into a new form of fear that resonated with millions. The god of horror was no god at all. He was a broken man who found meaning in meaninglessness. who turned his existential dread into art that outlived him by nearly a century. Sometimes the greatest creators never live to see their greatness. His lesson is this: what torments you might be the very thing that makes you immortal. Your darkest fears, your deepest isolation, your strangest dreams, they might be gifts waiting to be unwrapped. If you made it this far, comment "Cosmic Dread" to prove you've glimpsed what Lovecraft saw. The truth is never comfortable, but it's always worth knowing. History has more to teach us. Subscribe if you want to learn. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant.